It's a little nerve-wracking, but I'm excited. So let's start with prayer. Abba, Father, we come before you today on your holy, set-apart day, on your Sabbath, to read your word and dwell with you and fellowship with you. And I ask that you would just open our eyes to receive insight and revelation from your word. Your word is living and active, and I ask that it would come alive to us, that it wouldn't just be a storybook, but that we would realize that it's real and it's applicable. Open our eyes, open our hearts, and open our minds to receive what you have for us today. In Yeshua's name, amen. Okay, so the first portion is going to be Exodus 13, verse 17 through 14:8. Does anybody want to read that? (13:17). You're late, Mallory. Anybody? Mr. Aaron.
After Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not guide them to the highway that goes through the land of Philistine, because it was close by. God thought that the people, upon seeing war, might change their minds and return to Egypt. Rather, God led the people by a roundabout route, through the desert by the Sea of Suf. The people of Israel went up from the land of Egypt fully armed. Moshe took the bones of Yosef with him, for Yosef had made the people of Israel swear an oath when he said, God will certainly remember you, and you are to carry my bones up with you away from here. They have traveled up from Sukkot and set up camp in Etam at the edge of the desert. Jehovah went ahead of them in a column of cloud during the daytime and led them on their way, and at night in a column of fire to give them light. Thus they could travel both by day and by night. Neither the column of cloud by day nor the column of fire by night went away from in front of the people. Jehovah said to Moshe, Tell the people of Israel to turn around and set up camp in front of Pi Hachirot, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal Zephon, camp opposite it by the sea. Then Pharaoh will say that the people of Israel are wandering aimlessly in the countryside. The desert has closed in on them. I will make Pharaoh so hard-hearted that he will pursue them. Thus I will win glory for myself at the expense of Pharaoh and all his army. And the Egyptians will realize at last that I am Jehovah. The people did as ordered. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart towards the people. They said, What have we done letting Israel stop being our slaves? So he prepared his chariots and took his people with him. He took 600 first-quality chariots, as well as all the other chariots in Egypt, along with their commanders. Jehovah made Pharaoh hard-hearted, and he pursued the people of Israel, and they left boldly.
Does anybody have any comments on that? One thing I found super interesting in verse 17 of chapter 13, the very first verse, God is doing things for the Israelites to protect them, and they don't even realize it. And how often does he do that in our lives, where he's moving on our behalf and we don't see it? How many times should we be thanking him for things that we haven't seen because he's moving on our behalf, whether we see it or not? So I just found that interesting. Any other comments? Will somebody read the second portion, which is Exodus 14, 9 through 14? It's a nice short one.
But the Egyptians pursued them with all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, as well as charioteers and his army, and overtook them as they were encamped by the sea, beside Pihahiroth, opposite of Zephon. When Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel lifted up their eyes and beheld the Egyptians were marching after them. So they were terrified, and the sons of Israel cried out to Adonai. They said to Moses, "Have you taken us away to die in the wilderness because there were no graves in Egypt? Why have you dealt this way with us to bring us out of Egypt? Did we not say to you in Egypt, let us alone, so that we may serve the Egyptians? It was better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of Adonai, which he will perform for you today. You have seen the Egyptians today, but you will never see them again, ever. And Adonai will fight for you while you hold your peace."
Thank you, Gabe. Anybody have any comments?
I find it interesting that God took them a different way to avoid war and to avoid stuff. And the first thing they do is complain. Because like you said last time, Josiah, they don't realize why he's taking them a different route. But, I mean, how many times do we complain about where we are? And maybe that's where God's taking us instead of somewhere that's worse.
Yeah, I think I'd like to echo that sentiment. Like we were just discussing, or you brought up in chapter 13, verse 17. It's interesting that Adonai purposefully kept the Israelites away from war for the fear, because they could be afraid and it could cause them to fall away. And then later on, he brings them to a place where they would be afraid and they begin to doubt. But they ultimately don't. We know, as explained later on in the chapter, that God provides a way for them. And so it's interesting because we're always told God will not provide, or God will not set you on a path that you cannot follow. And this is a interesting syllogism where we're shown on one part that God intentionally leads us away from a path that is too hard for us, but leads us into a path that might appear too hard for us. But just being faithful and staying on it, even throughout our doubts and throughout our descent, He is faithful and He will take us through it. And I think that's just a very interesting syllogism that happens just a few verses away from each other.
Verse 10, it says that Pharaoh drew near, and the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. There's an interesting midrash on this passage that actually says that this moment in verse 10, what the Israelites saw in the spiritual realm was not necessarily the army of the Egyptians coming after them, but rather the spirit of Israel coming after them. Because if you go to the book of Daniel, right? In the book of Daniel, there's the prince of Persia that Gabriel has to wrestle with to come talk to Daniel. So every nation has a spiritual principality or a force that governs it and reports back to God, but a lot of them are rebellious and they want to be worshipped instead. Kind of think about it as this way: our nation's governing spirit is Columbia, which is why Washington, D.C. is called the District of Columbia, because really a lot of our core founding fathers worship this Greco-Roman god called Columbia. But That's a side note there. The God of Egypt is literally coming after them. The spirit of Egypt is literally coming after them now. How did the rabbis get this? Verse 10, it says, "V'hinei Mitzrayim nosea," and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. Nosea means marching, means traveling, but it's in the single tense. It's in the single tense. When you have all of Mitzrayim, all the Egyptian army coming after them, it should be noseim. It should be plural with the im, I am ending, im. But here it's nosea in the singular. So an interesting thought that maybe why they were so scared was we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but principalities.
That was good.
In verse 13, where Moses is answering the people and he's saying to stop being afraid, remain steady, and you'll see how the Lord will save you. The verb remain steady, hit yatsev, is actually like a command to like report for duty. So he's kind of girding them up as if they were soldiers. And so because they're going into a battle, and to echo what he was just saying, it is like a battle formation because it is not just a physical realm thing that we're looking at. It's a spiritual realm. And what is the action that they're actually doing? It's literally just remaining steady. They don't have to do anything. And the following verse 14, our Father is going to do battle for us. All we have to do is remain steady. And so what that tells me is to not run ahead and to also not fall behind, but to just sit in the trust of him doing the work for me. There are times when we'll be called to action, to actual action, but sometimes the action itself is to remain steady, to not waver, and to trust in him and his battle plan. And I think that this kind of echoes when we saw Yeshua on the lake, and he's sleeping, and all of his disciples are freaking out because they're going to go overboard. There's this huge storm, and then, and he says, "Why are you so afraid?" And he just tells the storm to be quiet. It quiets down, and he's just like ready for the rest of his nap. And it just kind of echoes to me that instead of like the disciples freaking out, perhaps it's time for us to remain steady at times.
That was really good. Thank you. Anybody else?
So along that same vein, the thing that just struck me is the reeds. And I always thought that seemed out of place, but I think I just hit it based off of the point the young lady just made is you've got people being oddly asked to be still and quiet. And the term reeds then goes back to the river Nile when Moses was basically set adrift, right? And Miriam had to kind of just watch this, right? And there's obviously a plan there, and she's obviously in on it somehow, because this does not seem like a good rescue plan to me, right? Putting a child adrift in a basket of reeds, right? So that's the term that got me. And so there's a parallel there that's very powerful, which is just sit and watch. And Pharaoh came in that case too, right? It was his daughter, however. So there's a crossover there to that story as well that's extremely thematically connected. I don't know all the details, so I talk about it, but it just hit me there. Thanks.
So Hebrew for reeds, the word is suf. It corresponds to the Hebrew word sof, which means end. So whenever you see the reeds, Moses in the basket of reeds, or the Yam Suf, sea of reeds, it represents where the end of slavery is. This is the end of your time in Egypt where you were in bondage to the Egyptians. They're also camped out in a place called Pi Hachirot, and the word Hachirot is freedom in Hebrew. They're at the path of freedom, literally. They're scared for their lives because it doesn't look like they're going to be freedom, but they're told to sit still. The word is, like my sister said, hit yatsev, literally reflexive Hebrew, calm yourselves down. And then they have to, when they calm themselves down, they're reminded that the end is near. The end is near. So you can apply it to maybe if we're in the last days right now and things are getting a little shaky in the world, the end is near. And we don't say that like the end is near, we're going to freak out, but more like the end is near, Messiah's coming, deliverance is here, the end is near. It's encouraging.
I think a theme through this whole story of Moses is God taking care of what God wants by himself. When Moses was worried about how Pharaoh was going to react when he was going before Pharaoh, God said, why don't you worry about doing what I asked you to do, and I'll worry about everything else. And then here at this spot where Pharaoh's coming again, God had said, I'm going to make Pharaoh hard-hearted. He's going to pursue you, but I'm going to win glory for myself.
Anybody else? No. Anybody want to read the third portion, which is Exodus 14, verses 15 through 25?
Yahweh does fight for you, and you keep silent. And Yahweh said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Speak to the children of Israel and let them go forward. And you, lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and let the children of Israel go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I am strengthening the hearts of the Egyptians, that they shall follow them. And I am to be esteemed through Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh, when I am esteemed through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the messenger of Elohim, who went before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the column of cloud went from before them and stood behind them, and came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. And it was the cloud and the darkness, and it gave light by night, and one did not come near the other all the night. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Yahweh caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, and all the horses of Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And it came to be, in the morning watch, that Yahweh looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the column of fire and cloud, and he brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion. And he took off their chariot wheels, so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for Yahweh fights for them against the Egyptians.
Thank you, Zach. Any comments on that section?
Yeah, where he says, why are you crying out to me? It's like Moses is already supposed to know it, like he's talking to him, like he's supposed to know what to do. Lift up your rod and part the sea. And I just thought, it took me back to like Psalm 23, your rod and your staff comfort me. And, they thought that in the Israelites' mind, the sea is death. So they went through the valley of the shadow of death at that point. And that's what I got.
One thing I found interesting was even when you don't see a way out, he always makes a way. Like they're staring at these chariots and horses, and they don't see a way out. There's a whole bunch of water behind them. But he always makes a way, even when we can't see it.
I find it interesting that after all that they have done with the signs and wonders with Pharaoh, that what I get out of this, what you had said, is that Moses still doesn't either accept or receive his identity and his authority in Yeshua. And I think Yeshua is pointing out, why are you coming to me? I have taught you. I have shown you. I've given you the power through Jesus, well, not Jesus' name, but through his name. And Moses is still like, I don't know what to do with that. So.
The first thing that popped into my head as we were reading through this is Hebrews 11:29, where it talks about, that's the Hall of Faith portion in Hebrews. And it's talking about how by faith the Israelites walked through on dry ground. But because of their lack of faith, the Egyptians were swallowed up by it. And the thing that stood out to me was Pharaoh's hard-heartedness. The word there is chazak, and it's strengthened or encouraged or made firm, or it could be stubbornness. But we also use that same word chazak as an encouragement to be strengthened. And so it's whose faith, what did he have faith in? Because the Israelites were able to get through because they trusted in the Lord. And perhaps Pharaoh, his chazak, was himself. Because at that time, of course, he was told that he was a god. He was, and which throws me back into Antiochus IV, so that's a whole other thing. But who we put our trust in, what we put our trust in, is it ourselves? Or is it the Lord? And he's the one who's going to make a way when there is no way, versus us trying in our own strength and believing in ourselves. Sometimes the obvious thing isn't what we're supposed to do. It's always to trust in him.
Do we often wonder if we were in Moses' seat, how we would react? Would we respond the same way he did? In 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 13, it gives us some admonition there that what was happening to Moses, and we question, why did he respond the way he did, whatever. It says in verse 11, now all these things happen unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Wherefore let him that thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. For there hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that which you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that they may be able to bear it. So these things were written especially for those in these days that we're in today. And so it's a good story to help us remain faithful, to stand and watch, and that just doesn't mean just wait around and do nothing. A waitress is always serving, but to continue to declare to the world, the hope that is within us, and and I can even just look at the things that are happening in this world today, and what's going on in the World Economic Forum. We wonder how in the world are we going to be delivered from all this, but he's making the way. And I think we've seen it. He used Cyrus in his day. I think he's using a Cyrus in our day. but he will make the way, and we have to just totally rely on him.
So when it talked about just the Mitzri knowing that I am Yahweh, when I am steamed through Pharaoh's chariots and the horsemen, it just made me think of the last bit of Psalm 20, where it talks about, we sing of your deliverance. In the name of our Elohim, we set up a banner. Yahweh does fill all your requests. Now I know that Yahweh shall save his anointed. He answers him from his set-apart heavens. With the saving might of his right hand, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we remember the name of Yahweh our Elohim. They have bowed down and fallen, but we have risen and are established. Save, Yahweh. Let the sovereign answer us in the day we call. It just made me think about, who they're trusting in, what the young lady back there said, just who they're trusting in and who they're putting their faith into, wait on.
That's good, thank you. One thing, going back to kind of what Mike said, kind of jumping between what a few people have said, is he makes the way, but we still have to choose to go that way. With 1 Corinthians 10:13, he will make a way for you to escape, but you still have to choose that way. When there's temptation, you can either choose the temptation or you can choose the way out. So you still have to rely on the Father and trust him to take you down that path. Any others?
I don't know, Donnie, maybe you can help me out with this, but the term honor, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten me honor upon Pharaoh and the chariots. This term seems more like a form of retribution, or almost like it's evening some score. Not necessarily that God was gaining honor through the death of these evil people, but it's retribution for the babies in the Nile or something like that. Because it's not an honorable thing. I think the term is just a little misapplied there. It seems like it's to even a score somehow on some level of holiness. Those men that were after Israel didn't seem eager about this, and perhaps they even thought they might come out the other side and be free from Pharaoh. There's just a bigger story about what's happening here, I think, other than the white hats winning and the black hats, getting beaten.
So going off of that, Tom, you're touching on something very important here. It's about like point for point retribution here. Because think of it this way. Back in the 1800s, if I insulted someone's honor, right? I insulted another man's honor. What would he do to regain his honor back in the 1800s? I challenge you to a duel. We'd walk 10 paces apart and fire pistols at each other and pray someone survives, right? In this case, it says in the first verse of the Torah portion, this is forgive me, I'm still a little under the weather. It says in 13 verse 17, it says, Vayhi b'shalach paro et ha'am, he sent the people, as Pharaoh sent away the people, v'lo nacham Elohim derech eretz Pilishtim. The Lord did not send them away by the way of the Philistines' land. But he did not lead them, or he did not send them away. Is that in the Hebrew literally means velo nacham? What that literally means is God was not comforted. So he did not lead them. Nacham could also be nacham, comforted. Meaning each of the 10 plagues corresponded to a certain type of affliction that the Egyptians put on the Israelites, and the children of Israel are walking free, and God's looking at everything the children of Israel said, and he says, it's not enough. My children have been hurt for 400 years, and the Egyptians have gotten off free here. So think about it. We think of God in terms of a loving God, and he is loving towards us, but think about how he feels towards our enemies, like in the spiritual realm. At the end of the day, God's children are walking away free, but the enemy still has one crime they have not paid for, and that is the children being thrown in the river. And the river turning to blood was not enough to cover that. So, v'lo nacham literally means God was not comforted. And his children are walking away free. But the enemies of God's people are receiving the judgment in this passage.
Sorry, I also wanted to add to that, that I think that our Father shows a differentiation between the leader of the Egyptians, Pharaoh, and their warring band, their soldiers, their chariots, and all of that, and the basic everyday citizens of Egypt, because a lot of the plagues that he did send, of course, they affected the Egyptians, but part of it was he wanted to open their eyes to see that he was God. And he says that repeatedly, even in this section, where it wasn't enough, and there's more that needs to come. He says the Egyptians will realize at last that I am Adonai, and he repeats that. That's in chapter 14, 4. The Egyptians will realize, and then he says it again in. Well, he repeats it. I can't find it exactly, and I don't want to waste your time, but he's continuously, basically, he's looking out for those Egyptians who are your everyday citizens, because they also, if we remember, they sold themselves to Pharaoh. During that famine, when Joseph was ruling, they sold themselves, the Egyptians, the basic Egyptians. The only ones who did not sell their land and their cattle and their own bodies were the priests and things of their multiple gods. So they also were enslaved to their leader. And so God was also looking out for not just those who are his children, Israel, but this is another call out to the nations. This is your chance. See that I am the real God.
To follow up on both of your points, I've got the Hebrew Bible, 14, 18, then the Egyptians will realize that I am Adonai when I have won my self-glory at the expense of Pharaoh, his chariots, and his captivity. And God is a warrior, Jehovah Gabor, and he is a champion. And this has been a tough, tough battle for 400 years. And so now he is proclaiming, I have finally won, which is a victory and a comfort for all of us. And we need to remember who he is in that aspect.
Sorry to grab it again. We're talking about the distinguishing, right, between the common Egyptians and the Egyptian government. I think it's very interesting. If you ever get a chance, go watch videos on the true location of the Red Sea crossing. You'll literally see the coral formations on ancient chariot remains sitting at the bottom of this underwater land bridge. God literally created an underwater land bridge, and the rabbis actually in ancient Israel, they talk about how God created an underwater land bridge because the Red Sea is so steep and deep. So he created an underwater land bridge for them to walk on, and you can find this underwater land bridge between Egypt and Arabia, and it's got these chariots on it. But we're talking about distinguishing between the common Egyptian and the common Israelite. What we're going on here is the powers of Egypt being broken, specifically the spiritual powers. Because if you look at Ezekiel, God sits in a chariot or a throne. You can call it a chariot, Ezekiel chapter 1. And you got these 4 spiritual creatures hanging out around these 4 wheels of the chariot. So if you think of these 4 spiritual beings, right, hanging around the chariot wheels, there's a connection between angels and wheels. So when it talks about the wheels coming off the chariots, literally, when the Egyptians are coming into the Red Sea, it's literally talking about, as they're coming one by one, it's a sign of the spiritual power of Egypt being broken off the wheels, which is why they can't drive in the middle of the Red Sea, because that angel is being drowned in that sea.
Yeah, that's really good. Mike has one.
Yeah, kind of back to Tom's comment. It helps also to understand the culture of the ancient Near East, and it was an honor and shame culture, and it was always a battle between kings and countries whose God was the real God, and whoever won, then the God that they served was the victor. And in Exodus 11, it mentioned there that or 12 in verse 12, he said, when I passed through the land of Egypt to smite all the firstborn, he goes on to say that, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. So when he says that I will gain honor upon Pharaoh and all the Egyptians, it was a battle of whose God was superior, and that's the point he was making in those statements, because and he all the plagues, and you heard me say this before, each plague was a judgment against the gods that they served, and the frogs, the beetles, whatever, to show that their theology was all messed up. But they will know, and if you remember, some of Pharaoh's advisors came to him and says, we cannot fight against the God of Israel. Their God cannot. Our gods cannot compete against him. I don't know if you remember that, but so it was all about who was the true God, and all the plagues, and I believe, God's purpose was to help turn the hearts of the Egyptians, and many of them I think did, because it was a mixed multitude that came out with Israel, and so that's God's ultimate hope that all will come to the knowledge and salvation, and so back to the the honoring of Pharaoh, and he says, I will gain honor. He was showing his power, that he is. There was no God before them that could divide the waters and control the waters. That was the final judgment. And so, anyway.
So we were a little late, but we were listening on our drive, and we keep coming back. There's so much in this portion. One of the things that stood out to me was that right at the beginning of this portion, it says that God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter, for if they face war, they might change their mind and return. Several people already commented on this. I wanted to add that direction would have offered many routes of escape if they became fearful, and instead, as we were dissecting this and adding, Yahweh led them to their backs against the sea, and they had no choice. They had to. They were. Granted, they thought they were going to be slaughtered. Yahweh wanted to make sure that he led them in a way that he could display his power, and that wouldn't have been possible if he led them a different direction, where their flesh could take over and they could have fled. I thought that was an interesting way to look at it. And there's so much layer and depth here that I'm sure we're going to be continually doing this through the rest of the day if we stay on this topic. But I just wanted to point that out.
Somebody had a hand up over here.
I find it interesting that the Egyptians, before they died, with their mouths confessed that it was Yahweh that intervened. And so we get the concept of a second witness, and then we'll find out third or, later that we have third and fourth witnesses to this event. And the thought that this is like the valley of the shadow of death. It just brought up we're going through a hard time where even we elect a leader, and that's what his name meant. Biden means through the valley of the shadow. And the parallels there that don't go unnoticed.
We've only got a few minutes left, so does somebody want to read Exodus 14:26 through 15:26?
Then Yah said to Moshe, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, and let the waters come back upon the Mitzrites, on their chariots and on their horsemen." And Moshe stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its usual flow, at the break of day, with the Mitzrites fleeing into it. Thus Yah overthrew the Mitzrites in the midst of the sea, and the waters returned and covered the chariots, and the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them, and not even one was left of them. And the children of Israel walked on dry ground in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right and on their left. Thus Yah saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Mitzrites, and Israel saw the Mitzrites dead on the seashore. And Israel saw the great work which Yah had done in Mitzrayim, and the people feared Yah, and believed Yah and his servant Moshe. Then Moshe and the children of Israel sang this song to Yah and spoke, saying, "I sing to Yah, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. Yah is my strength and song, and he has become my deliverance. He is my El, and I praise him, Elohim of my father, and I exalt him. Yah is a man of battle, Yah is his name. He has cast Pharaoh's chariots and his army into the sea, and his chosen officers are drowned in the sea of reeds. The depths covered them, they went down to the bottom like a stone. Your right hand, O Yah, has become great in power. Your right hand, O Yah, has crushed the enemy. And in the greatness of your excellence you pulled down those who rose up against you. You sent forth your wrath, it consumed them like stubble. And with the wind of your nostrils the waters were heaped up. The flood stood like a wall. The depths became stiff in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I pursue, I overtake, I divide the spoil. My being is satisfied on them. I draw out my sword. My hand destroys them. You did blow with your wind. The sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Yah, among the mighty ones? Who is like you, great in set apartness, awesome in praises, working wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your loving commitment, you led the people whom you have redeemed. In your strength, you guided them to your set-apart dwelling. Peoples heard, they trembled. Anguish gripped the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom were troubled. The mighty men of Moab, trembling grips them. All the inhabitants of Canaan melted. Fear and dread fell on them. By the greatness of your arm, they are as silent as a stone, until your people pass over, O Yah. Until the people whom you have bought pass over. You bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, in the place, O Yah, which you have made for your own dwelling, the set-apart place, O Yah, which your hands have prepared. Yah reigns forever and ever, for the horses of Pharaoh went with his chariots and his horsemen into the sea. And Yah brought back the waters of the sea upon them. And the children of Israel went on dry ground in the midst of the sea. And Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aharon, took the timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and with dances. And Miriam answered them, Sing to Yah, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. And Moshe brought Israel from the sea of reeds, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And they came to Marah, and they were unable to drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. So the name of it was called Marah. And the people grumbled against Moshe, saying, What are we to drink? Then he cried out to Yah, and Yah showed him a tree. And when he threw it into the waters were made sweet. There he made a law and a right ruling for them, and there he tried them. And he said, If you diligently obey the voice of Yah your Elohim, and do what is right in his eyes, and shall listen to his commands, and shall guard all his laws, I shall bring on you none of the diseases I brought on the Mitzrites. For I am Yah who heals you. And they came to Elim, where there were 12 fountains of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the waters.
Thank you very much. I think we are all out of time, so I'm going to pray, and then you are dismissed. Abba, you are so good. I thank you for just speaking through your word, revealing things to your people. Abba, I ask that you would be lifted high today and that you would be exalted and that there would be no other gods before you today. Because you are the only true God. There is no one like you. There is none beside you. May you be exalted and glorified today. In Yeshua's name, amen.